The first time it hit, the crew of the Panther tank didn't even hear the shot. In the autumn gloom of 1944, sound was a constant, muddy drone of engines and distant artillery. This was different. There was a flash, a sharp, violet-white spark on the hull, followed by a penetrating hiss, like a white-hot poker plunged into water. And then, something impossible happened. The side armor, 40 millimeters of hardened German steel, sloped precisely to defeat conventional rounds, simply gave way. It didn't shatter. It wasn't cracked or spalled. It opened like butter under a hot knife, a perfectly circular hole appearing where invincibility used to be. Inside the compartment, the air turned to fire. The physics of the impact were instantaneous and savage. Metal glowed orange, then white, in a fraction of a second. The loader's hand was still on the breech of the 75 millimeters cannon when the wave of superheated gas and molten metal flash vaporized his position. 3 seconds. That is the clinically estimated time it took for a sealed, 5-man crew compartment to become a high-pressure crematorium. The radio operator, jammed in the hull, tried to scream, but his lungs had already collapsed from the ungodly pressure spike. Only the driver, wedged in the front hull and partially shielded by the transmission block, survived long enough to crawl from the escape hatch, his face a mask of char and disbelief. "Dus Verena Granata," he whispered to the medics who dragged him clear. That wasn't a shell. That wasn't a shell. He was right. It was something else entirely. It was a terrifying new variable in a war that, by the autumn of 1944,
the Sherman
had become a brutal,
armored,
predictable equation of steel versus steel. Every tank battle, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the fields of Lorraine, was a mathematical duel. Thickness of armor, measured in millimeters. Velocity of shell, measured in meters per second. Angle of impact, measured in degrees. The Germans, with their superior engineering and wartime doctrine, had mastered this game. Their Panther and Tiger tanks were rolling fortresses, apex predators of the battlefield. Their frontal armor was so thick, so well sloped, that standard-issue American 75 millimeter shells bounced off like pebbles, a demoralizing clang that was often the last sound a Sherman crew ever heard. This wasn't a fair fight. It was a slaughter. U.S. tank crews called their own M4 Shermans death traps and Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter's slogan, "Lights first time, every time." Fighting the German heavy tanks was, in their words, suicide. The reports filtering back to Allied high command from Normandy were not just grim, they were catastrophic. Sherman crews reported needing 5-to-1 odds just to survive an engagement with a single Panther, often by sacrificing multiple tanks in flanking maneuvers to get a desperate shot at the weaker side or rear armor. Morale was hemorrhaging. The entire Allied advance, built on the back of American industrial might and armored divisions, was stalling against this wall of German steel. Something had to change, or the war in Europe would grind to a bloody stalemate. But the change wasn't coming from the front lines. It was coming from a quiet laboratory deep within the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. That's where the Office of Scientific Research and Development, the OSRD, had been grappling with this deadly equation.
Understood.
They weren't trying to build a bigger gun or a heavier tank. They were experimenting with a radical concept: A projectile that didn't rely on high explosives, but on pure, weaponized physics and material science. The key was a metal so dense, so incredibly hard, that it defied conventional metallurgy. Tungsten carbide. This was more than an engineering problem. It was a geopolitical one. Tungsten, or wolfram, was a strategic resource, rarer and more vital than oil. The Allies had spent years in a quiet, vicious economic war with the Axis to control the global supply, primarily from neutral Portugal and Spain. While German scientists, lacking this critical resource, were forced to experiment with hardened steel cores, American engineers had access to the mother lode. They were designing a projectile that didn't just hit armor, it disregarded it. A small, dense core of tungsten carbide that could punch through steel like a needle through cloth. But the physics were untested in the chaos of combat. Could it truly work? Or would it be another failed experiment? Another false promise that died in the mud of France? Taking more crews with it, the answer was about to be written in fire. The weapon they created was officially designated M93 high-velocity armor-piercing, or HVAP. But to the engineers who designed it, it was a marvel of metallurgy. To the soldiers who would fire it, it was known by a simpler, more visceral name: the hot shot. The name was a chillingly accurate description of its function. The round itself looked alien. It was smaller than standard ammunition. A dense, dark core of tungsten carbide held inside a lightweight aluminum sabot, a French word for a wooden shoe. This sabot was the genius of the design. It gripped the rifling of the barrel, allowing the full force of the propellant to launch the projectile, only to fall away like a discarded shell casing once it left the muzzle. This separation allowed the slender, incredibly dense tungsten dart to fly free, unencumbered by the drag of a full-sized shell. The velocity it achieved was unprecedented for a tank-fired gun. Over 3,400 feet per second, nearly double the speed of a conventional 75mm round. In the cold mathematics of war, kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. The M93 had just squared the velocity. When tungsten moving at that speed strikes hardened steel, something extraordinary happens. It is not a conventional penetration. The kinetic energy doesn't just crack the armor, it transforms. The impact zone instantly superheats to temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Celsius, well above the melting point of steel. The tungsten penetrator, with its own astronomically high melting point, doesn't liquefy. But the German armor around it does. The projectile essentially drills through, creating a high-pressure jet of molten metal, superheated gas, and pulverized steel fragments that floods the interior crew compartment. It was, in effect, a plasma torch delivered at the speed of a bullet. The first shipments arrived in France in October 1944, delivered under armed guard. They were distributed only to veteran crews in tank destroyer battalions and select Sherman platoons equipped with the new 76mm guns. The orders were strict. Fire sparingly. This was not ammunition to be wasted on soft targets. Each round cost more than a soldier's monthly pay, a strategic asset in a war of attrition. There was no room for waste, no time for field testing. The rounds were to be used only against heavy armor. Panthers, Tigers, and the new, monstrous King Tigers rumored to be moving west. Nobody told the tank crews what, precisely, would happen when they pulled the trigger. They were about to find out. The first recorded engagement occurred near Metz, France, on the 29th of October 1944. A platoon of M4 Shermans, part of Patton's Third Army, encountered 3 Panther tanks defending a critical river crossing. The German crews were confident, bordered on arrogant. They had been hunting Shermans for weeks, and their doctrine was proven. Wait for the Americans to close, absorb their useless high-explosive and armor-piercing fire on the thick frontal glacis, and then, at their leisure, obliterate them one by one. The lead Sherman gunner, Sergeant Michael Hartley, was given the order to fire. He loaded the strange, new round at 800 yards, a range where his standard shots would normally bounce. He took aim at the lead Panther. He didn't know what to expect. The recoil felt sharper, the report a deafening crack rather than the familiar boom. What he saw through his periscope made him question his sanity. The Panther simply stopped. There was no dramatic explosion, no turret blow-off like in the training films. It just stopped. A moment later, thick, greasy smoke began pouring from the closed hatches. Then came the screaming, a sound that cut through the battlefield noise. And then, abruptly, silence. The other 2 Panthers, crewed by veterans of the Eastern Front, did something unheard of. They immediately deployed smoke and retreated, vanishing back into the fog of war. Apex predators do not run from prey, but what they had just witnessed was not prey. They didn't know what had hit their comrade, neither did Hartley. But when U.S. combat engineers examined the destroyed Panther days later, they found something that shouldn't have been possible. A perfectly round, 3-inch hole in the side armor. The edges were not jagged. They were melted smooth, as if cut by a master glassblower. The interior, they reported, looked like the inside of a furnace. One engineer, a man accustomed to the grim wreckage of war, was overheard whispering, "Jesus Christ, it cooked them." The secret was out, but the legend was just beginning. Word spread through the Allied armored divisions like wildfire. Crews who received the HVAP rounds treated them like sacred ammunition. They were hoarded, marked with chalk, and saved for the one moment they truly needed a miracle. Tank commanders, in their letters home, began describing an almost mystical faith in these new shells. "We've got something now." Where? One letter from the 4th Armored Division read, "Something that evens the odds." But across the lines, something else was spreading. A cold, creeping terror. German tankers, the hardened veterans of Kursk and Normandy, began reporting incidents that defied all logic and training. Panthers disabled with single, inexplicable shots. Tigers abandoned after mysterious, instantaneous fires. Crews found dead at their posts with no visible wounds, just horrific burns that seemed to have originated from inside the tank. The Wehrmacht's Technical Intelligence Branch, the Waffenamt, scrambled to collect these battlefield reports, trying to piece together what the Americans had deployed. The initial theories bordered on the fantastic. Some officers insisted it was a new form of incendiary round, perhaps based on captured Japanese phosphorus technology. Others claimed it was a chemical weapon that ignited on contact with armor, a clear violation of the Geneva Convention. One captured German officer, in an interrogation, insisted the Americans had developed a heat ray, a directed energy weapon based on the forgotten theories of Nikola Tesla. The truth that it was simply advanced metallurgy and kinetic physics seemed almost too mundane by comparison. But to the men inside the tanks, there was nothing mundane about it. When you watched a Panther's crew bail out, screaming, their faces blackened and uniforms smoldering, you didn't think about tungsten carbide cores. You thought about witchcraft. This weapon wasn't just defeating German armor, it was defeating German certainty. Their entire war machine was built on a foundation of technological superiority. The Tiger, the Panther, these were not just tanks. They were symbols of an engineering prowess they believed was unmatched. This new American round was an intellectual and psychological assault. It suggested that their best was no longer good enough. Then, on the 16th of December 1944, the Ardennes forest exploded. Under the cover of a blinding snowstorm, Hitler launched his last desperate gamble. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by hundreds of elite Panzer tanks, smashed through the thin American lines. The goal was audacious. Split the Allied forces in two, capture the critical supply port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the Reich collapsed under the weight of two fronts. Panzer columns, including the feared SS Panzer divisions, rolled through the mist and snow like iron ghosts. For 3 days, German armor seemed unstoppable. They overran American positions, encircled entire regiments, and pushed deep into Allied territory. American tank crews, many of whom were equipped with the precious HVAP rounds, found themselves fighting in sheer chaos. Engagements were happening at point-blank ranges, a desperate brawl in the fog. Ammunition was critically low, but in the midst of the panic and retreat, something strange was happening. Panthers that should have dominated these close-range duels were being knocked out at impossible angles. A Sherman, firing from concealment in a snowdrift, would hit once, just once, and the Panther would be finished. Not disabled, not damaged. Done. Crews that tried to bail out of the burning wrecks collapsed in the snow, steam rising from their uniforms. The German field reports, radioed back in panic, became increasingly desperate. Enemy possesses unknown armor-defeating weapon. One radio intercept from the Panzer Lehr division read, "Conventional tactics ineffective. Request immediate tactical reassessment." But there was no time for reassessment. The Panzers had to keep pushing. Every day counted. Every hour mattered. They didn't know they were fighting against physics itself. And physics doesn't negotiate. The epicenter of this technological and psychological collapse was a farmhouse near the encircled crossroads town of Bastogne. Here, the remnants of American armored units, fighting alongside the 101st Airborne, were down to their last resupplies. Among the few crates dropped through the fog were 60 rounds of 76mm HVAP ammunition. The math facing the defenders was not just grim, it was genocidal. 17 operational Shermans were facing an entire Panzer division. In the old calculus of war, this was an annihilation. But Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the relief force breaking into the pocket, was a master of armored warfare, and he understood the new math. He made a cold, brutal calculation. Every single HVAP round had to count. He gave an order that would become legend. No firing at infantry, no suppression fire, no warning shots, only killing shots against heavy armor. His gunners were instructed to wait, to hold their fire with iron discipline, until they could literally see the Balkenkreuz, the German cross painted on the hulls. If you can't see their paint, he told his commanders, you're too far away. The attack came at dawn, a wave of gray steel emerging from the snow-laden trees. The Panther commanders advanced with the confidence of predators. Their thick frontal glacis plates angled perfectly to deflect any round the desperate Americans could fire. The first Sherman fired at just 90 yards. The HVAP round hit the lead Panther's glacis plate, the 80 millimeters of supposedly impenetrable frontal armor. The tungsten core, traveling at over 3 times the speed of sound, punched through. The Panther, weighing 45 tons, rolled forward another 10 feet from sheer momentum before its own ammunition cooked off, blowing the 7.5-ton turret 40 feet into the air. The second Panther commander saw this, and in that split second, he hesitated. It was a fatal error. Another HVAP round took him through the turret side. The third Panther tried to reverse, its tracks spinning frantically in the snow. Too late. By the time the German attack stalled, 7 Panthers lay smoking in the snow. The Americans had fired 11 rounds total. 7 confirmed kills. This was not a battle. It was an execution. This single small-scale engagement sent a shockwave up the German chain of command. Tankers began refusing orders to advance without massive infantry support. Some crews, in desperation, began welding extra armor plates onto their tanks, creating improvised, spaced armor, hoping to disrupt whatever devil round the Americans were using. It didn't work. The HVAP rounds punched through the extra plating and the main armor behind it as if they were a single sheet of paper. The tungsten cores were traveling so fast, with so much kinetic energy, that the additional steel barely slowed them down. Panic set in. This was no longer combat stress. It was psychological collapse. Veterans who had survived Kursk, men who had fought across the frozen steppes of Russia without flinching, now showed signs of acute breakdown. One decorated Panther commander, an ace with dozens of kills, shot himself in his command cupola rather than lead his crew into another engagement against the 76mm guns. Another deliberately crashed his tank into a ditch, claiming a mechanical failure that engineers later could not find. The Waffen-SS command threatened to execute deserters on the spot, but even their infamous commissars couldn't stop the hemorrhaging morale. The captured German tanker, the lone survivor of a crew hit near Stavelot, told his interrogators everything. "It's not a shell," the man whispered, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't hold a cup of water. "Shells you can defend against. Shells follow physics. This is something else. It passes through the steel like the steel isn't even there." The interrogator, a Nisei sergeant from the Military Intelligence Service, noted the man's 1,000-yard stare. The tanker had been inside a Panther when it was hit by HVAP. He was the only survivor, thrown clear by the initial blast. When asked how he escaped, he just stared at the wall.
Shell shock.
"I didn't escape," he whispered. "It let me live so I could warn the others." Behind the lines, German intelligence officers were under immense pressure from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht to identify and counter this new threat. It was a matter of strategic survival. SS Oberscharführer Ernst Bachmann, a decorated tank ace from the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, a man who had destroyed over 80 Allied tanks and was revered as a Panzer Knight, volunteered to lead a live fire analysis. This was not a patrol, it was a suicide mission dressed as reconnaissance. They would deliberately engage American Shermans, observe their tactics, document the weapon's performance, and, crucially, try to capture one of the mystery rounds intact for examination by Wehrmacht metallurgists. Bachmann took his Panther and 2 escorts into the contested, snow-choked forests near St. Vith. They found their targets quickly. 3 Shermans holding a frozen crossroads. The Panther crews felt a surge of their old confidence. 3 against 3, equal numbers. They had surprise. They had superior armor. They were the hunters. What could go wrong? Everything. The lead Sherman, a 76mm equipped model, fired first at over 1,000 yards a distance, where the German crews thought they were all but immune. The HVAP round crossed the intervening space in less than a second. Bachmann's wingman didn't even have time to react. The tungsten penetrator hit his Panther just below the turret ring, a spot protected by 80mm of sloped steel. It punched through, ricocheted off the hardened steel of the turret basket, and, in a display of pure kinetic violence, exited through the opposite side of the turret. The crew was dead before they understood they had been hit, their systems vaporized by the internal pressure wave. Bachmann, horrified, ordered a full retreat, screaming into his microphone, but his second wingman's transmission was cut off mid-word, replaced by a burst of static. Another single shot. Another dead tank. Bachmann's Panther fled at maximum speed, its driver weaving desperately through the forest. The entire crew expecting any moment to feel that terrible, final, silent impact. It never came. The Americans let him run. They didn't need to kill him. In a masterful stroke of psychological warfare, they needed him to go back and tell the others. They needed the legend to spread from the mouth of an ace. By January 1945, the psychological impact of the HVAP rounds had become as devastating as their physical lethality. German tactical manuals were hastily rewritten. Panzer commanders were instructed to never present their side armor, to always move in wolf packs, to immediately deploy smoke and retreat if they encountered Shermans that might be equipped with the witch round, or die Hexengeschoss, as the terrified tankers had begun calling it. But the Wehrmacht's industrial capacity, pounded daily by Allied bombers, was collapsing. There was no time to redesign armor, no resources to reinforce tank battalions, and most critically, no tungsten to develop a counterweapon. Germany's scientists, brilliant as they were, understood the principle of tungsten-cored ammunition. Their problem wasn't physics. It was geopolitics. Germany had lost the resource war years earlier. Its access to the vital tungsten mines in Portugal and Spain had been severed, first by Allied economic warfare, where British and American agents simply bought the entire supply at inflated prices, and then by the Allied advance itself. The very material that made the HVAP so devastating was now a strategic impossibility for the Reich. It was the bitterest irony. Germany's metallurgists could have designed similar ammunition, but wars are not won by blueprints. They are won by resources, by logistics, by the simple, brutal ability to manufacture what you need when you need it. The Reich was out of time and out of tungsten. Meanwhile, American production, the arsenal of democracy, ramped up into high gear. By February 1945, HVAP ammunition was being supplied to every 76mm and 90mm gun in the European theater. What had started as a scarce, precious, miracle round was becoming standard issue. The experimental wonder weapon had become just another round in the ammunition rack. A democratization of lethality that signaled the end of the German tank's reign. The definitive, final moment. The event that shattered the myth of German armor for good came at the Rhine crossing in March 1945. What was left of the Wehrmacht had established a final, desperate defensive line, anchored by the most powerful armored vehicles in the world. The Königstiger, or King Tiger, weighing nearly 70 tons. Its frontal armor was over 180 millimeters thick, sloped at an angle designed to make it absolutely immune to any Allied tank gun. Nothing the Allies
Weighing over
possessed,
40,000
according
pounds,
to
the
every
slugger's
ballistic
primary
table,
armament
should
was
have
this
been able to
massive
penetrate it.
90mm M3 gun.
They staked their entire defensive strategy on this single, material fact. The Americans knew it, too. But they also knew something else. The Hot Shot program had evolved. For their powerful 90mm anti-tank guns, they now had the T-30E16 HVAP, a longer, faster, and even deadlier version of the Tungsten penetrator. When U.S. tank destroyers from the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion engaged the King Tigers at 1,200 yards, the German crews must have felt invincible. At that range, at that angle, they should have been untouchable. The first T-30E16 round hit a King Tiger's frontal plate dead center. For a single heartbeat, nothing happened. The German crew might have even laughed, a moment of arrogant relief, thinking the Americans had just wasted a shot on their strongest point. Then, the turret hatches, weighing hundreds of pounds, blew open as if kicked by a giant. Black smoke erupted, followed instantly by a plume of white-hot flame. The tungsten core, backed by an unstoppable equation of mass and velocity, had done the impossible. It had punched through 180 millimeters of the finest crucible steel the Reich could produce. The crew inside never knew what happened. One moment they were invincible. The next, they were gone. The other King Tigers, witnessing this violation of physics, retreated. For the first time, and for the last time, the myth of German armor superiority died completely. Not in a protracted battle, but in a single, silent flash. When Allied forces finally crossed the Rhine, ordnance teams and technical intelligence units began a systematic analysis of the battlefield. What they found confirmed the extraordinary, terrifying physics at work. The HVAP rounds weren't just penetrating, they were fundamentally changing the calculus of war. Metallurgical examination of the destroyed Panthers and Tigers showed penetration holes with clean, almost laser-like edges. They were surrounded by heat-affected zones, where the German steel had partially liquefied before resolidifying, a physical scar left by the round's passage. Inside the tanks, forensic teams discovered something even more disturbing. Crew members were often found killed not by spalling or an ammunition explosion, but by the rapid, catastrophic pressure spike, the barotrauma, and the thermal flash that followed penetration. Some bodies showed minimal external trauma, but had suffered catastrophic internal injuries. Lungs burst, organs ruptured from the sheer overpressure. The tungsten penetrator, moving at hypersonic velocity, was creating a plasma-like jet that filled the crew compartment in microseconds. Captured German engineers and metallurgists, now prisoners of war, described their frantic, failed efforts to counter the weapon. They had tried everything: spaced armor, ceramic inserts, angled deflection plates. Nothing worked consistently. We knew the physics. One German metallurgist from the Krupp works explained to his interrogators. We understood the principle of the arrow shot. We just didn't have the materials or the time to apply them. The final revelation came when U.S. technical intelligence examined captured German documents from the Ardennes offensive. Among them were classified reports describing the unknown American weapon, and more importantly, psychological assessments of Panzer crews. One report, dated January 12, 1945, was particularly striking. It described how veteran German tank commanders were showing symptoms of acute combat stress disorder, not from the intensity of combat, but from its unpredictability. The enemy weapon does not behave according to established ballistic principles, the report stated. Armor that should protect does not. Distance that should provide safety does not. Crews report feeling helpless, as if their training and equipment are meaningless. The morale impact is catastrophic. The Germans had encountered something worse than a superior weapon. They had encountered incomprehensible technology. The HVAP rounds had created what military psychologists now call technological terror. The fear that comes not from visible danger, but from an invisible, seemingly unstoppable force. It was the same psychological impact that medieval armies felt encountering gunpowder for the first time, or that soldiers in World War I experienced during the first gas attacks. The Wehrmacht's Panzer divisions, once the pride of German military innovation, had been undone not by tactics or strategy, but by material science. By tungsten carbide traveling at 3 times the speed of sound, by physics weaponized. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Allied ordnance teams compiled the final statistics. HVAP rounds had accounted for less than 5% of all tank ammunition expended, but were responsible for over 30% of confirmed heavy armor kills in the final 6 months of the war. The numbers told a story of efficiency that bordered on the surgical. But the human cost told a different story. Interviews with surviving German tank crews revealed lasting psychological trauma. Men who had survived the Eastern Front reported nightmares about the burning shot, the round that came without warning and left nothing behind but molten metal and ash. Today, the science that seemed like witchcraft in 1944 is fundamental to military engineering.
It is hopeless.
Every modern tank-fired APF-SDS, armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot round, many tipped with depleted uranium, owes its design lineage to those experimental shells rushed to the front lines. The principle remains: hypervelocity, ultra-dense projectiles that defeat armor through kinetic energy alone. The Germans were right. It wasn't a shell in the traditional sense. It was the future, a glimpse of warfare where victory belongs not to the heaviest armor, but to whoever can manipulate matter and energy more efficiently. The HVAP round proved that wars are won in laboratories as much as on battlefields. It wasn't witchcraft that defeated German steel. It was tungsten, traveling at the speed of inevitability.